Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Midday News Summary video. In this video, we will gather the most prominent and latest news related to international conflicts and developments. And now, here are the details. Russia intensifies its offensive in Ukraine. The KF launches a deep strike in retaliation. This morning, May 19th, the Russian news outlet News reported that the Russian military continues its offensive on multiple fronts in the Ukrainian battlefield, gaining control of numerous residential areas in recent weeks and closing in on strategic targets. Meanwhile, Ukraine has also intensified its drone strikes, targeting both the front lines and deep within Russian territory. In just the past week, Russian armed forces have liberated 5 settlements in the Special Military Operations Zone. Of these, 2 are in the Japonica region, 2 in the Don People's Republic, and 1 in the Sumy region. This was reported by the Russian news agency RA Novosti, citing the Russian Ministry of Defense. Previously, from May 5th to 11th, Russian armed forces gained control of 4 more settlements, including 2 in Japonica, 1 in Sumy, and 1 in the Dnipropetrovsk region, increasing military pressure on the eastern and southeastern fronts of Ukraine. The Christovidius, the head of the Russian army, General Valery Gerasim, stated that units of the Western Army Corps are completing the liberation of Kupian's Uslovy in Kharkiv province. This is a strategically important transportation hub. He also personally inspected the progress of the Central Army Corps' combat mission, which is currently actively operating in the Dnipropetrovsk province. The Russian Ministry of Defense also confirmed the liberation of the Privoli settlement in the Donetsk People's Republic and the village of Priluki in Zaporizhzhia, thanks to the effective operations of the Southern Group and units of the Sans Clash Eastern Group. Meanwhile, Russian military expert Andrei Maroko stated that after consolidating the gains made in the Slavyansk city direction, Russian forces have begun strong operations to liberate the Nikiforovka settlement in the Donetsk People's Republic. This information has not yet been officially confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Alongside the ground advances, air combat is also intensifying. Ukrainian media reported a series of large explosions in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, forcing authorities to declare an airstrike alert across the entire Dnipropetrovsk province. Details regarding damage and casualties have not yet been released. Earlier, a powerful explosion was also recorded in Odessa amid simultaneous air raid sirens in the Odessa, Mykolaiv, and the Dnipropetrovsk provinces in southern and central Ukraine. Conversely, Russia accused Ukrainian forces of intensifying attacks on energy infrastructure in the Zaporizhzhia province under freezing weather conditions. Governor Evgeny Belitsky said that attacks on thermal power plants and substations put significant pressure on the civilian energy system. In the Donetsk People's Republic, local authorities reported that Ukraine had shelled residential areas twice within 24 hours, firing a total of 4 shells that damaged 2 civilian infrastructure facilities. No civilian casualties have been reported so far. Notably, in the early morning of October 18, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that its air defense forces had shot down and intercepted 63 Ukrainian UAVs in various regions, including 23 destroyed in Belgorod province, 13 in Chizhbryansk, 6 in Rostov, 6 in North Ossetia and Alania, 4 in Astrakhan, 4 in Volgograd, and 2 in Sea province. However, the incident also had civilian consequences. The head of the Republic of North Ossetia, Alania, Serge Manilo, confirmed that debris from the UAV fell on an apartment building in the city of Beslan, injuring 2 children and 1 adult. The victims received prompt medical attention. Ukraine. The U.S. continues peace talks with Russia on the sidelines of the Davos Forum, but a breakthrough is unlikely. On the sidelines of the UEFA World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, held from May 19 to 23, Ukraine and the United States agreed to continue discussions regarding the peace process with Russia. This comes amidst a nearly 4-year-long conflict with no signs of abating. The Ukrainian president acknowledged that the Ukrainian government and Washington do not yet fully agree on several key issues. Information about the continuation of peace negotiations was confirmed by Rustem Umerov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. The country's top negotiator confirmed this after the latest round of talks between the 2 sides in Florida, USA. This morning, October 19th, the Engada's news agency reported that, speaking on his personal Telegram channel, Umerov stated that the Ukrainian delegation and U.S. representatives focused their discussions on post-war economic development plans, prosperity programs, and security guarantees for Ukraine, emphasizing concrete mechanisms for practical implementation, Umerov wrote. We have agreed to continue working at the negotiating team level during the next consultation phase in Davos. However, Ukraine's top negotiator did not mention the possibility of a face-to-face meeting between Ukrainian President Zelensky and U.S. President Donald Trump in Davos. According to international media, Trump is expected to attend this year's forum, while the possibility of Zelensky also attending Davos has not been ruled out, although there has been no official confirmation. Reuters quoted Umerov as saying that the 2 days of consultations in Florida with the U.S. side, including Special Envoy Steve Waxall, President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, Army Secretary Daniel Risko, and White House official George Genbaum, were mainly in-depth exchanges and did not result in a concrete agreement. The Ukrainian delegation participating in the talks included Presidential Office Representative Kirylo Budanov and the leader of the ruling party's parliamentary faction, Servant of the People, David Arakhamia. Ukraine stated that it had informed Washington about recent Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. According to Reuters, Ukraine is now demanding that the U.S. clarify Russia's position on peace initiatives promoted by Washington. Meanwhile, the U.S. is pressuring the Kyiv to accept a peace framework, which will then be presented to Moscow. Conversely, Ukraine and its European allies emphasize the need for long-term security guarantees to prevent the risk of Russia relaunching military operations in the future. Regarding the negotiation process, Ukrainian MP Alexei Goncharenko noted that the exchanges in Florida were not going smoothly and were unlikely to yield positive results. President Zelensky also acknowledged that Kyiv and Washington were not entirely in agreement on several key issues in negotiations with Russia. Conversely, President Trump declared on the 15th that the conflict resolution process was bogged down by the Kyiv's position, and also stated that Russia was more willing than Ukraine to reach an agreement. Moscow shared this assessment with. It has been alleged that President Zelensky is hindering the peace process. However, in response to the criticism, Zelensky asserted that recent Russian airstrikes show Moscow is not truly interested in diplomacy. The Independent reported this morning, May 19th, on the sidelines of the Davos Forum, that Ukraine and the U.S. may also sign an economic agreement and continue consultations on security guarantees within the framework of an initiative by a coalition of countries willing to support Ukraine. However, the prospect of a breakthrough remains fragile due to big differences between the parties involved. Russia condemns Britain for returning to piracy, while London showcases a special operation to seize Russian ships. Russia vehemently criticizes Britain's recent plans and actions to intercept, arrest, and seize Russian ships at sea, arguing that London is openly returning to an era of piracy and trampling on international law. This morning, May 19th, TASS reported that the Russian ambassador to the UK, Andrei Kin, declared that discussions in London about intercepting Russian ships at sea are essentially a revival of piratical thinking. He said that what politicians in London are talking about is essentially a return to the era of the pirate Edward Tack, nicknamed Rodin. They forget that he has long ceased to be the master of the oceans, and such actions will inevitably come at a price. The Russian ambassador emphasized that Western countries have for years relied on double standards to harm Russia after the current level of disregard for international law has reached unprecedented levels. He urged him to carefully consider the risks before embarking on dangerous adventures. Earlier, the BBC reported that the British government had found a legal basis to allow the military to seize ships based on the 2018 Anti-Money Laundering and Sanctions Act, thereby permitting the use of force against vessels deemed to be in violation of sanctions. On July 7, the British Ministry of Defense confirmed that, at the request of the United States, London had assisted in the seizure of the Russian oil tanker Marinera, also known as B-1, in the Atlantic Ocean. Britain provided an airbase for the U.S. Air Force, deployed reconnaissance aircraft to monitor the ship, and dispatched ships to support the operation. The Russian Foreign Ministry subsequently demanded that Washington immediately cease its illegal actions against the Marinera and other ships operating legally in international waters, and called for adherence to the fundamental principles of maritime law. Internationally, while Russia strongly condemned the actions, British media openly detailed the naval special operations, presenting them as a model for dealing with Russia's so-called shadow fleet. One typical operation cited was the raid on the oil tanker Nave Andromeda in October 2020 inches the English Channel. At that time, the Liberian-flagged ship sent out a distress signal after being held hostage and threatened by 7 illegal immigrants for over 10 hours. Then, in just 9 minutes, the British Special Forces completed the operation. Soldiers disembarked from 2 helicopters onto the ship and quickly subdued the intruders. This is considered one of the few operations conducted independently by the UK without foreign involvement. According to British media, the success of this operation, along with the recent seizure of Marinera, has led the British government to believe it has sufficient legal grounds and military capabilities to seize more Russian ships passing through or approaching British waters. However, experts and former British Special Forces officers acknowledge that such operations are extremely risky and costly. One former Special Forces officer who participated in counterterrorism operations at sea stated that the level of preparation is very high and the risk of mishaps is significant. He couldn't imagine doing this on such a large scale with dozens or hundreds of ships. Beyond the military aspect, the legal issue is also contentious. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, even sanctioned vessels still have the right of innocent passage through international waters. The legal argument in the case is primarily based on the accusation that the ship illegally changed its flag mid-flight, both of which are prohibited under international law. Nevertheless, London believes that the 2018 sanctions law allows it to expand its intervention rights, particularly with regard to ships entering British territorial waters within 12 nautical miles. In fact, according to British press reports, at least 45 sanctioned Russian ships have recently passed through or approached British waters. Against this backdrop, tensions between the two countries at sea are rapidly escalating, with Moscow viewing London's actions as disguised piracy, while Britain sees them as a tough tool to tighten sanctions and exert strategic pressure on Russia. Europe is preparing for retaliation, and global markets are reeling from the risk of a trade war. The European Union is urgently seeking ways to prevent U.S. President Donald Trump from implementing his plan to impose new tariffs on European goods over the Greenland issue, while also preparing retaliatory measures. At a meeting on August 18th in Brussels, EU ambassadors reached a consensus on intensifying diplomatic efforts to persuade Trump to abandon the tariff plan amid escalating tensions surrounding Greenland. The day before, President Trump announced he would impose tariffs on Denmark, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, along with the UK and Norway, until the U.S. is allowed to purchase Greenland. This move met with fierce opposition from many European countries, which considered it blatant blackmail in international relations. According to Trump's plan, the U.S. would impose an additional 10% tariff on imports from the aforementioned countries starting January 1st, and this rate would increase to 25% from June 1st if no agreement is reached. France was one of the countries that protested. The strongest response? A source close to President Emmanuel Macron said Paris is pushing to activate the EU's anti-coercion mechanism. This is a mechanism that allows the bloc to restrict access to public tenders, investment, banking activities, or even tighten trade in services, an area where the U.S. has a large surplus with the EU, including digital services. European officials warn that if tensions escalate, this could be the biggest trade confrontation between the U.S. and the EU since 2025. At a time when Trump's broad tariff measures had already shaken global markets, his threat of imposing tariffs immediately caused significant volatility in global financial markets. According to Reuters, on the morning of May 19, the euro fell 0.2% to around $1.1572, its lowest level in 7 weeks, while the British pound also weakened. Conversely, the Japanese yen appreciated due to its role as a safe haven asset. Holger Schmidding, chief economist at the German-based multinational bank Berenberg, commented that hopes that tariff tensions had eased this year have now faded. We're returning to a situation similar to last spring. According to Capital Economics assessment, the countries most severely affected if the U.S. imposes tariffs are the UK and Germany. A 10% tariff could reduce the GDP of these two economies by about 0.1%, while a 25% tariff could cause economic output to fall by 0.2 to 0.3%. Meanwhile, European stocks remain near record highs, with Germany's DX index and the UK's FTSE 100 index both up more than 3% this month. Notably, European defense stocks have risen nearly 15%, benefiting from escalating geopolitical tensions. Experts warn that if a full-blown U.S.-EU trade conflict erupts, the impact will extend beyond just goods trade. George Saravellos, Global Foreign Exchange Research Director at Dock Bank, argues that the biggest risk lies in the potential weaponization of capital flows, as transatlantic financial linkages are at their deepest level ever. The World Economic Forum's annual risk survey, published ahead of the Davos conference, also ranked economic confrontation between nations as the biggest global risk in 2022, transcending armed conflict. That concludes our program for today. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye, and see you in the next program.